All right, guys. So today what we're going to learn to do is we're going to learn to throw our own errors. Now, that's a little bit different than defining our own errors, which is a thing that we could actually do. And there's a further point here that I should probably define the difference between an exception and an error. So an exception is when something goes off with code, period. Um, that can be something as simple as the keyboard interrupt. So if you hit Control C when you've got a terminal open and some code's running, it's going to crash stop. That's an exception. Now, errors are things that you should predict. They're exceptions, but not all exceptions are errors. So like a keyboard interrupt is an exception, but it's not an error because you shouldn't have to handle that crap in your code. Right, so an error should be something that you're expecting to have happen, like the user inputs a negative number when they should have input a positive number. Or a file's not found is an error that you should really be planning on dealing with, right? Because God knows users delete files or if you let them look them up, sometimes they disappear or they're locked or like a million other things. So there's a whole bunch of errors that you should learn to predict. And to this end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our factorial function from the other day. And right now, this factorial function is really only going to work if I feed it a positive natural number, right? So let me maybe show that off a little bit. So let me just print out the factorial function applied to 7 quick, right? Oops. Well, 1 we're after that. What is going on? Sorry, old console garbage. Come on, stop, come on. Okay, there we go. It's 50/40, perfect, check. If I feed in something like 7.2 and watch this go, I get a maximum recursion depth exceeded, right? So that's a special type of error called a recursion error. Now, if you want to know what all the error types are, I found this really slick list that I stole from somebody's blog that has, I recognize most of the Python exceptions and errors. So there's like base exceptions. Those are things like if you interrupt it or if you close the command window or if the system shuts down or something. And then as more specifically exceptions, there are both warnings and errors. So this whole column is all the error types. So there's things like operating system error, like connections error, or files exist or files don't exist, or let's see, we've got value errors, we've got type errors. Those we see all the time, right? There's a division by zero error up here in the arithmetic errors section. So there's all these different error types, and I don't expect you to have this list memorized by any means. I don't expect you to know what every error is coming from when it happens, right? But what this lets us do is make some specific changes to our code to better throw errors. So like when I put in 7.2 into the factorial function, that throws a recursion error, right? If I have a user using this program, they don't know what a recursion error is, nor should they have to. What I really should be throwing is my own kind of custom error that says like, hey, BT dubs, you really should be feeding a positive counting number into this thing. You can't just feed it any old float, right? Or if they feed it a string, right? Like say they feed it the string 7, just the string 7, right? If I hit run, I'm going to get a type error, unsupported operand type. Okay, so I'm with the type error, right? That's what I want it to say, but the unsupported operand type isn't really what's going on there. What's going on there is you pass it a string and it doesn't know how to deal with a string. Now, it's throwing that unsupported operand type, right? because it's trying to subtract 1 from your string, and it doesn't know how to do that. So what we need to do is be a little bit more specific about our errors. So at the top of our factorial function, let's add a little error processing of our own. So let's add if the type associated to the argument, right? So we're passing this thing an n. So if the type isn't an int, right? So if the argument they passed isn't an integer, like it's a float or a string or any of that crap, we should throw a type error. So we're gonna use the keyword raise is how you get an error, and we're gonna raise a type error, and make sure that's auto-completing, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at the correct thing. If you just hit raise and then you type in a function's name or something, it won't work. And you'll note that type errors have this Camelback naming scheme that's not the same as the one we use for functions. So that's a thing from PEP 8, right? All right, so I'm going to raise a type error, and type error is really a constructor, and you can pass it a prompt. So the prompt I'm going to pass this thing, let's see, I typed it out over here, is not of integer type and must be a positive integer, right? So I'm reminding them what happened. It's not an integer that you passed along. And then I'm reminding them that furthermore, I need a positive integer, right? Okay, so now if it gets past this, then it's at least an integer. So then my next test case is if n is smaller than 0, right? So if it's negative, I'm okay with it actually being 0 here. That's because I defined 0 factorial to be 1, which is a usual math function. Maybe I should add that to the doc string. Okay, so I added that 0 factorial is 1 to the doc string. All right, so if they've entered a negative number, I should raise, and now this one's not a type error, right? So the reason it's not a type error is the variable type is correct, but the value isn't. So I'm gonna, instead of raising a type error, I'm gonna raise a value error, right? And my value error is gonna say, let's see, I'll probably just steal this, right? N must be a positive integer, right? Okay, so now let me try to calculate factorial of 7, right? Okay, so see how I'm getting my own custom error here, right? And it's showing me where that came from. That came from this line, raise type error. You guys see that? Okay, so there's 2 parts of an error, right? There's the error itself, and then there's what's called the traceback, which is all this dump of where this thing came from that tells you which line was which, right? And when I put in my own raises, I just get the line that had the raise on it. So really that's coming from the previous line, right? All right, so that's that one. What if I did, say, -3? N must be a positive integer. That's a value error. Cool. All right, so I've got this thing more or less working the way I want it to. All right, now I'm going to deal with a perennial problem that I've had. Actually, you know what? I'm going to give you this one as an exercise. I think you can do this. I'm going to give you a little bit to start with. So the little bit I'm going to give you to start with is going to be this. I'm going to try to have you define an input integer function. And then this is probably something that you haven't ever seen before. So, dump this. So this feels a little funky. Okay, so that part where I put prompt equals, please input an integer with a new line, that feels a little weird, right? So the kick is that this function should normally be expecting an argument, right? So here what I've used is a keyword argument. I've given it a default value. And the default value for prompt that I've given it is this please input an integer thing. The reason for that is that I'm going to, in here, right? I'm probably going to use the input function, right? So don't be afraid to use that. In fact, what the heck? I'll give you this first line. Oops. All right, so here's my first line, right? And what this means is that if I pass along, okay, so right now that's my function. All it is an alias for the input function with this kind of default thing. So let me call that quick. So if I call the input integer function on nothing, right? I get this statement, please input an integer, right? And now it's waiting for me to do that, right? And if I do something with it, it doesn't return anything because it just gets stored in this user input variable that thereafter doesn't get used. Let's see, what am I whining about? Whining about a blank line there, and then we're probably also whining that this variable never gets used. Okay, whatever. What this default argument thing means is that if I want to put my own prompt in here, I can. So if I want to say guess a number instead, because I can't spell, I get that prompt, right? But if I choose not to put anything in there, I get the default. That gets to be a handy thing so that you can have optional arguments if you want, which is a nice trick to have for, oh, I don't know. Well, really, frankly, most things. You've probably wanted this feature a bunch of times already and just didn't know how to use it. Okay, so what I would like you to do is get this doc string to be telling the truth for your assignment. And I will give you just one more hint that this should take negative numbers and positive numbers. And for that, you might want to look into the starts with method for strings and the isNumeric method for strings. Both of those are going to be handy for getting this done.